My name is Sharon, a 63-year-old retired nurse from Michigan. My daughter Melissa was my whole world after my husband passed away. We shared everything, including the family home I purchased decades ago. When Melissa died from cancer, I never imagined her husband Richard would turn on me so quickly. The day after her funeral, he demanded I leave immediately. "The house is mine now," he yelled with cold eyes. I simply smiled and walked away, knowing something he didn't. If you're watching this right now, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see how a grieving mother finally stood up against injustice and how Richard's smug face changed when he learned the truth. The story of my family begins long before the painful events following my daughter's death. 25 years ago, I lost my beloved husband Michael to a sudden heart attack. He was only 42. The shock nearly destroyed me, but I had our 16-year-old daughter Melissa to think about. I couldn't fall apart completely. Michael had always been responsible with our finances. His life insurance policy gave us some security during that terrible time. I used most of that money to purchase our family home outright. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a comfortable 3-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood with good schools. Michael and I had always rented, dreaming of the day we'd own a home. I only wished he could have lived to see it. Melissa and I became incredibly close after her father died. She was my rock just as much as I was hers. We helped each other through the grief, and I watched her grow into an amazing young woman. She inherited her father's kind heart and my stubborn determination. After college, she became an elementary school teacher, passionate about making a difference in children's lives. 8 years ago, when Melissa was 31, she introduced me to Richard. He seemed charming, intelligent, and successful. Richard worked as a financial advisor at a respected firm downtown. He had a confident way about him that impressed me initially, though I did notice he often dominated conversations and occasionally spoke over Melissa. Still, she seemed happy, and that was what mattered to me. "Mom, he makes me feel special," Melissa told me after they had been dating for a few months. "He has such big plans for our future." I remember nodding and smiling, but something in my gut felt unsettled. Mother's intuition, perhaps. There were small moments that gave me pause. The way he would check his phone when Melissa was speaking. How he subtly criticized her clothing choices or suggested she change before they went out. How he always had to drive even in her car. But I pushed these concerns aside, telling myself I was being overprotective. When they married 5 years ago, I was genuinely happy for them, despite my reservations. The wedding was beautiful, and Melissa glowed with joy. Richard gave a charming toast about finding his perfect match. Everyone was moved. I remember hugging him that day and whispering, "Take good care of my girl." He smiled confidently and said, "Always, Sharon. She's my world now." After the wedding, I began noticing changes in Richard. The charming man who had courted my daughter started showing a more controlling side. He made financial decisions without consulting Melissa, despite her being equally capable with money. He monitored her spending and questioned her purchases. When she wanted to take a summer course to advance her teaching certification, he discouraged it as unnecessary. "Richard thinks we should be saving more," she explained when declining a mother-daughter weekend trip I had planned. The disappointment in her eyes was unmistakable. 3 years ago, I had a mild health scare. Nothing serious in the end, just elevated blood pressure that led to a brief fainting spell at the grocery store. Melissa was terrified of losing me and insisted I move in with them. At first, Richard seemed supportive of the idea. "Family should stick together," he said during dinner one evening. "Besides, you could help around the house while Melissa is teaching." I agreed, renting out my house to a lovely young family. I used my nursing background to justify my presence, saying I could help manage Melissa's increasing migraines, which I later discovered were likely stress-related. What Richard didn't know was that before moving in, I had quietly transferred the house solely into my name. It had technically been in both mine and Melissa's names previously, something I had done when she turned 25 as a safety net for her future. But after seeing Richard's controlling behavior, I made the change with Melissa's full knowledge and consent. "Just a precaution, sweetheart," I told her. "I've seen too many messy situations in my life." Melissa had agreed, though she seemed uncomfortable discussing any potential problems in her marriage. Once I moved in, Richard's true colors became increasingly apparent. He began subtly excluding me from family decisions, planning dinners out without informing me until the last minute, or discussing vacation plans as if I weren't in the room. When I offered opinions on household matters, he would smile thinly and say, "Sharon, we appreciate your input, but Melissa and I need to make these decisions as a couple." Melissa would look torn in these moments, caught between her husband and her mother. I tried my best to give them space, often retreating to my room to read or watch television when Richard came home from work. I didn't want to be the cause of any tension in their marriage. Then 18 months ago, our world shattered. Melissa was diagnosed with aggressive ovarian cancer. The prognosis was grim from the start, but my daughter faced it with incredible courage. Richard seemed shocked by the diagnosis and promised to be by her side through everything. "We'll fight this together," he assured her, holding her hand as we sat in the oncologist's office. I believed him then. I wanted to believe him. The 18 months of Melissa's illness were a blur of hospital visits, chemotherapy sessions, and brief periods of hope crushed by devastating setbacks. As a former nurse, I took on much of the caregiving responsibility naturally. I accompanied her to treatments, managed her medications, and held her hair back during the worst bouts of nausea. Richard was often absent during these critical moments, claiming work commitments kept him at the office late. "Someone has to keep earning," he would say defensively when I questioned his absence. "These medical bills aren't paying themselves." While that was technically true, their insurance covered most expenses, and I was contributing my entire pension to help. But I kept my peace for Melissa's sake. She needed calm and positivity, not domestic tension. During her better days, Melissa and I shared precious moments that I now treasure beyond words. We would sit in the garden when she felt strong enough drinking tea and reminiscing about happier times. She spoke often about her students wondering how they were doing with the substitute teacher. "I miss their morning hugs," she said once her eyes distant. "The way they get so excited when they finally understand a difficult concept." As her condition worsened, I noticed Richard growing even more distant. He spent more time on his phone, often stepping out of the room to take calls. When he was home, he seemed distracted and impatient with the reality of Melissa's deteriorating health. The mess of medications on the nightstand irritated him. The medical equipment in their bedroom made him uncomfortable. He began sleeping in the guest room, claiming Melissa's coughing kept him awake. One afternoon, about 4 months before she died, Melissa asked me to sit with her while Richard was at work. She seemed unusually serious, her face pale but determined. "Mom," she said, taking my hand weakly in hers. "I need you to promise me something." "Anything, sweetheart," I replied instantly. "Be careful with Richard after I'm gone." Her eyes held mine steadily. "I've seen things, noticed things. He's not the man I thought I married." My heart sank. "What do you mean, Melissa?" "Has he hurt you?" She shook her head. "Not physically, but I've found strange text messages. There are unexplained charges on our credit card. And sometimes the way he looks at me now." She trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. "Like I'm an inconvenience." I wanted to press for more details, but she was already exhausted from this brief conversation. I simply held her hand and promised I would be careful. That night, I lay awake, wondering what else my daughter had discovered about her husband. In the final weeks, Melissa's condition deteriorated rapidly. The cancer had spread throughout her body, and the doctors transitioned from treatment to comfort care. I moved a cot into her hospital room, refusing to leave her side. Richard visited daily, but rarely stayed overnight. The last 3 days were the hardest. Melissa drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes recognizing us, sometimes lost in delirium. I sang to her softly, the same lullabies from her childhood. I moistened her lips with water when they became dry, and adjusted her pillows countless times, seeking any position that might offer some comfort. On her final night, she briefly regained lucidity. Richard had gone home to get some proper sleep, so it was just the two of us. "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm not afraid anymore." "I'm right here, baby," I told her, fighting back tears. "I'll always be right here." She squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "I know. You've never left me." Then she closed her eyes and drifted away again. By morning, she was gone. Slipping away so quietly, I wasn't sure of the exact moment she left us. Richard arrived an hour after I called him with the news. His eyes were red, but I couldn't tell if he had been crying or if he simply hadn't slept well. He stood at the doorway of the hospital room for a long moment before approaching Melissa's body. He placed a kiss on her forehead, whispered something I couldn't hear, then turned to handle the paperwork with an efficiency that struck me as oddly detached. That night back at the house, I was too devastated to sleep. I wandered downstairs for tea around 2 in the morning and found Richard in Melissa's home office going through her desk drawers. He quickly closed the drawer when he noticed me standing in the doorway. "Just looking for the insurance documents," he explained, not quite meeting my eyes. "And her will. We'll need those soon." I nodded numbly, too exhausted by grief to question him further. But as I returned to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The look in his eyes wasn't sorrow, but calculation. The funeral service was held at the small Methodist church where Melissa had taught Sunday school. The sanctuary overflowed with people whose lives she had touched. Current and former students, fellow teachers, neighbors and friends all came to say goodbye. The flower arrangements were beautiful, predominantly featuring yellow roses, Melissa's favorite. Richard had allowed me to make most of the funeral arrangements, stepping in only to approve costs or make decisions when I became too overwhelmed. During the service, he sat beside me in the front pew, his posture rigid and his expression appropriately solemn. He delivered a brief but well-crafted eulogy that sounded rehearsed to my ears. "Melissa was the love of my life," he said, his voice steady. "Her compassion and spirit brightened every room she entered. I will carry her in my heart forever." The words were perfect, perhaps too perfect. There were no breaks in his voice, no moments where emotion overcame him. It felt like watching an actor play the role of grieving husband rather than witnessing genuine grief. Throughout the reception afterward, friends and family approached us with condolences. Many embraced me tightly, sharing personal stories about Melissa that brought both tears and gentle laughter. Several people made comments that now pierce me with irony. "Thank goodness you have Richard to lean on during this difficult time," my cousin Barbara said, squeezing my hand. "You're so lucky to have each other," echoed Melissa's friend Jenna, supporting each other through this awful loss. Richard played his part flawlessly, putting a comforting arm around me when others were watching, accepting condolences with dignified nods and thanking people for coming. Not once did I see him shed a tear, though his eyes remained appropriately red-rimmed throughout the day. By evening, I was emotionally and physically exhausted. The house had finally emptied of well-wishers, leaving behind casserole dishes and flower arrangements. I sat heavily on the living room sofa, still wearing my black dress, unable to summon the energy to change. Richard emerged from the kitchen with a glass of whiskey. Gone was the supportive son-in-law from hours earlier. His face had hardened his movements, brisk and businesslike. "We should talk about arrangements," he said, sitting across from me in Michael's old armchair. The chair I'd kept all these years that Melissa had insisted on bringing to their home. "Arrangements," I repeated, my grief-fogged mind struggling to follow. "Living arrangements," he clarified, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Obviously, things need to change now." I stared at him, uncomprehending. "What do you mean?" "Sharon," he said with exaggerated patience. "This situation was temporary. You moved in to help with Melissa. Now that she's gone..." He let the sentence hang in the air between us. The implication slowly penetrated my grief. "You want me to move out?" "Now." My voice sounded distant to my own ears. "Not this minute," he said with a dismissive wave. "But soon. I need to move forward with my life." I felt a spark of anger cut through my numbness. "Richard, we just buried my daughter, your wife, today. And I'm grieving too," he countered, though his eyes remained cold. "But practical matters don't disappear because we're sad." "This is my house," I reminded him, my voice growing stronger. At this, he actually laughed, a short, harsh sound that chilled me. "No, Sharon. This house belonged to Melissa and me, and now it's mine." He pulled a folded document from his pocket and tossed it onto the coffee table between us. "Melissa put the house in both our names after we married. It's right there in black and white." I didn't need to look at the document. I knew it was the old deed before I had made the transfer. But in that moment, seeing the calculating look in his eyes, I made a decision. I wouldn't reveal what I knew. Not yet. "I'm going to bed," I said quietly, rising from the sofa. "We can discuss this when we're both less emotional." Richard's jaw tightened with obvious irritation, but he nodded curtly. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I heard him pour another drink. Sleep eluded me that night as I lay awake wondering how quickly the man my daughter had loved could transform into this cold stranger. The morning after the funeral brought no reprieve from Richard's growing hostility. I awoke early, my eyes swollen from crying through the night. The house was quiet as I made my way to the kitchen to prepare coffee, clinging to the simple routine to keep myself grounded. Richard appeared in the doorway as the coffee brewed, already dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and slacks, as if heading to a business meeting rather than spending a day in mourning. He watched me silently for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I found some interesting paperwork in Melissa's files last night," he announced without preamble, pouring himself coffee. "Insurance policies, investment accounts. She was quite thorough with her documentation." I nodded, unsure where this conversation was heading. She always was organized, even as a child. Richard leaned against the counter, studying me over the rim of his mug. "I also found her will. Did you know she had one drawn up during her treatment?" My heart quickened. "No, she never mentioned it specifically." This wasn't entirely true. Melissa had told me she was putting things in order, but hadn't shared details. "Interesting." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Well, I've had time to think about our conversation last night, and I've made a decision. I need you to move out today." The bluntness of his statement struck me like a physical blow. "Today, Richard. That's impossible. I haven't even started to process Melissa's things, let alone find somewhere to go." His face hardened. "I'm giving you 2 hours to pack whatever you need. You can come back for the rest later." 2 hours, I echoed in disbelief. "After everything we've been through. After I cared for your wife through her illness, while you were barely present." Something dangerous flashed in his eyes. He slammed his coffee mug down, liquid sloshing over the sides. "Don't you dare question my devotion to Melissa." I worked myself to exhaustion providing for her, making sure she had the best care possible. You were hardly there, I countered, finding unexpected strength in my rising anger. Do you know how many nights she cried, wondering where you were? Richard's face flushed red. I don't have to justify myself to you. The house is mine now, he yelled, his controlled facade crumbling completely. Mine, I've checked all the paperwork. Everything Melissa owned passes to me. That was our arrangement. I stood very still, absorbing his rage without flinching. Years of nursing had taught me to remain calm in the face of emotional outbursts. I understand you're grieving, Richard. We both are. But this is my home too. Not anymore, he spat, pulling out his phone to check the time. It's 8:15 now. I want you gone by 10:30. Pack what matters most and leave the rest. I'll have it shipped to wherever you end up. In that moment, looking at this stranger who had shared our home for years, I made a decision. I would not argue. I would not fight. Not yet. I needed time to gather my thoughts and speak with Melissa's lawyer. All right, Richard, I said quietly. I'll go. He seemed taken aback by my sudden compliance suspicion flickering across his features. Just like that, I confirmed, setting down my untouched coffee. But I will be taking all of Melissa's personal items, her childhood mementos, photos, the quilt her grandmother made her. Those aren't yours to keep. He shrugged dismissively. Take whatever sentimental junk you want. I'll be redecorating anyway. The casual cruelty of his words stung, but I maintained my composure as I turned and walked upstairs to my room. Once there, I methodically began packing, focusing on the practical task rather than the emotional weight of what was happening. I carefully selected clothing for a week, my essential medications and toiletries. Then I moved to Melissa's childhood bedroom, which we had converted to a storage room years ago. There I gathered photo albums documenting her entire life, from her hospital newborn photos to her wedding day. I took the handmade quilt her grandmother had created for her high school graduation, her childhood teddy bear with one eye missing, and the box of Mother's Day cards she had made me throughout her school years. In her office, I collected her journals and teaching awards, along with the flash drive she had given me months ago, saying simply, "Keep this safe, Mom." I hadn't looked at its contents yet, respecting her privacy, even in illness. Richard appeared in doorways, periodically checking his watch, ostentatiously, reminding me that my time was running out. With each appearance, his demeanor grew colder, more impatient. 45 minutes left, he announced, as I carefully wrapped Melissa's cherished snow globe collection in bubble wrap. You're taking an awfully long time. These are irreplaceable, I said, simply continuing my careful work. 20 minutes, he said later, leaning against the hallway wall as I struggled to close an overfilled suitcase. Need some help? I'd be happy to speed things along. The mockery in his tone was unmistakable, but I refused to engage. I'm managing fine, thank you. Finally, with just 5 minutes remaining of his arbitrary deadline, I rolled 2 large suitcases to the front door, along with 3 boxes of precious mementos. Richard stood in the living room, arms crossed, watching my efforts with cold satisfaction. Where will you go? He asked, not out of concern but curiosity. To my sister Janet's, I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. She lives about 30 minutes from here. Good. I'll have your mail forwarded. He pulled out his wallet and extracted $300. Here, for your troubles. The insulting gesture nearly broke my carefully maintained composure. I looked at the money, then back at him, a small smile forming on my lips. Keep it, Richard. You might need it more than me soon enough. Confusion flickered across his face. What's that supposed to mean? I simply smiled wider and turned toward the door. You'll find out. Goodbye, Richard. The house is mine now, he called after me, his voice rising again in anger, perhaps unnerved by my calm. Mine, don't think you can contest it. I paused at the threshold, taking one last look at the home where I had lived with my daughter, where we had shared joy and sorrow, laughter and tears. Then I walked away, my head held high, leaving Richard standing in the doorway, momentarily robbed of his triumph by my unexpected dignity. The drive to Janet's house was a blur. Once safely parked in her driveway, the reality of what had happened finally hit me. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and sobbed, releasing all the grief and rage I had contained in Richard's presence. I cried for Melissa, for the life she had lost, for the truth she had discovered too late about the man she married. I cried for myself and the double loss I was enduring. Janet found me there, still crying in the car. She opened the door and wordlessly wrapped her arms around me, holding me as I shook with sobs. "He kicked me out," I finally managed between gasps. "The day after we buried her. That bastard," Janet whispered, her voice thick with anger. "Come inside, Sharon. You're home now." The 2 weeks following my eviction passed in a fog of grief and exhaustion. Janet's guest room became my sanctuary, a place where I could freely express my sorrow without Richard's cold, calculating eyes watching my every move. My sister, 5 years my junior, and widowed herself, understood my need for both space and support, providing both in perfect measure. "You take all the time you need," she assured me repeatedly. "This is your home for as long as you want it to be." Around day 3 of my stay, when the initial shock began to fade, I finally called Thomas Reynolds, the lawyer who had handled both my husband Michael's estate years ago and apparently Melissa's final arrangements. His secretary recognized my name immediately and scheduled an appointment for the following day. Thomas's office hadn't changed much in 20 years, still furnished with the same heavy oak desk and leather chairs. The man himself had aged his once dark hair, now silver, but his eyes remained sharp and kind behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Sharon," he greeted me, rising to take my hand in both of his. "I'm so deeply sorry about Melissa. She was an extraordinary young woman." "Thank you, Thomas," I replied, taking the offered seat. "I understand my daughter consulted with you recently." He nodded, his expression turning serious as he settled back behind his desk. "Yes, several times during her illness. The last time was about 2 months before she passed." He hesitated, seeming to consider his words carefully. "She was concerned about certain matters." "Richard," I stated simply. Thomas didn't confirm or deny maintaining professional discretion. "Melissa asked me to handle her will and made some specific requests regarding the reading of it. She wanted it to take place exactly 1 month after her funeral. That would be 2 weeks from now." "Did she tell you that Richard kicked me out of the house the day after her funeral?" I asked directly. Thomas's professional demeanor cracked slightly, surprise and disapproval flashing across his features. "No, she didn't predict that specifically, though she did express concerns about your living arrangements after her passing." He opened a folder on his desk. "However this information changes things, we may need to move up the timeline." "What did she tell you, Thomas?" I asked. "About Richard?" He considered me for a long moment before answering. "Attorney-client privilege remains in effect even after death, as you know. However, Melissa explicitly authorized me to share certain information with you if circumstances warranted." He leaned forward. "She discovered Richard was having an affair with his colleague Stephanie Lewis. It had been going on for at least a year before Melissa's diagnosis." Though I had suspected something like this, hearing it confirmed sent a wave of anger through me. "While she was fighting for her life," I whispered. Thomas nodded grimly. "She found text messages, hotel receipts. She confronted him once early in her treatment. He denied everything, called her paranoid, suggested the medications were affecting her thinking. Gaslighting her while she was vulnerable." I said, my hands tightening into fists in my lap. "Precisely. She decided then to make certain arrangements without his knowledge." Thomas produced another document from the folder. First, regarding the house, you transferred ownership solely to yourself 3 years ago, correct? I nodded. Yes, with Melissa's knowledge and consent. We didn't tell Richard. Smart move, Thomas said with approval. Melissa mentioned this to me. She also made sure her will reflected her wishes regarding any joint property or accounts she shared with Richard. As our conversation continued, Thomas explained the legal situation thoroughly. The house was legally mine, without question. Richard had no claim to it whatsoever, despite whatever outdated documents he might possess. Furthermore, Melissa had left detailed instructions about her personal possessions and the modest life insurance policy she had maintained separately from the one Richard had taken out on her. There's something else you should know, Thomas added, his expression grave. Melissa asked me to investigate Richard's financial activities during her illness. She suspected he was misappropriating funds from their joint accounts, possibly even taking loans against assets without her knowledge. Did you find anything? I asked. Enough to raise serious concerns, he confirmed. Nothing that rises to the level of criminal charges yet, but certainly enough for civil action if you choose to pursue it. By the end of our meeting, we had formulated a plan. The will reading would proceed as Melissa had requested exactly 1 month after the funeral. Thomas would send Richard formal notification. In the meantime, he would prepare the necessary documents to formally evict Richard from my property, giving him the standard 30 days notice required by law. Should I warn Richard in advance? I asked as our meeting concluded. About the house, I mean. Thomas considered this before shaking his head. Let him discover it at the will reading. That was what Melissa wanted, and I think she had good reason. The days leading up to the will reading were filled with practical preparations and emotional processing. Janet became my rock, accompanying me to follow-up meetings with Thomas, helping me organize the documents I'd need, and simply sitting with me through evenings when grief would suddenly overwhelm me like a tidal wave. During this time, I began receiving calls from mutual friends who had noticed Richard's inappropriate behavior. Melissa's close friend Jenna called, horrified, after driving by the house and seeing an unfamiliar woman's car in the driveway barely a week after the funeral. I went to leave some flowers on the porch, she explained, her voice tight with anger. And this blonde woman answered the door, said her name was Stephanie, and she was helping Richard through this difficult time. Can you believe that? Others reported similar sightings. Richard and Stephanie dining at Melissa's favorite restaurant, the two of them carrying shopping bags from high-end stores at the mall. One of Melissa's former colleagues even spotted them looking at luxury cars at a dealership. He's spending money like water, Janet observed after one such report. Do you think he's expecting a big insurance payout? Probably, I replied. What he doesn't know is that Melissa changed the beneficiary on her personal policy to me, not him. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to help me restart my life. The day before the will reading, I visited Melissa's grave for the first time since the funeral. The headstone had not yet been placed, but the ground had been leveled and covered with fresh sod. I placed yellow roses on the earth and sat beside the temporary marker. I miss you every minute of every day, I told her, running my fingers over the engraved letters of her name. But I promise you I'm going to set things right, just like you planned. I paused, swallowing hard against the lump in my throat. I wish you could be there to see his face tomorrow. You always did have a flair for dramatic justice. As I rose to leave, I placed my hand over my heart. I'll carry you with me always, my sweet girl, always. The morning of the will reading dawned bright and clear, a beautiful spring day that seemed at odds with the somber occasion. I dressed carefully in a simple black dress, the same one I had worn to the funeral a month earlier. Janet helped me style my hair and insisted I eat breakfast, despite my lack of appetite. You'll need your strength today, she reminded me, placing a plate of toast and scrambled eggs in front of me. This is your moment to reclaim what's yours. Thomas's office was located in a converted Victorian house, downtown. Its interior remodeled into professional spaces while maintaining the charm of the original architecture. Janet and I arrived 20 minutes early as planned, and Thomas greeted us in the reception area. "Everything is prepared," he assured me quietly. "The conference room is set up. Richard hasn't arrived yet, but he confirmed yesterday that he would attend." We had just settled into the large conference room when we heard voices in the reception area. Richard's unmistakable baritone carried through the door, followed by a female voice I didn't recognize. My stomach tightened as I realized he had brought Stephanie to Melissa's will reading. When they entered the room, Richard froze momentarily upon seeing me clearly not expecting my presence. He recovered quickly, his face assuming a practiced expression of somber dignity. Beside him stood a tall blonde woman in her mid-30s, wearing an inappropriately tight black dress that looked more suitable for a cocktail party than a legal proceeding. "Sharon," Richard acknowledged stiffly, "I didn't realize you would be here." "Of course she's here," Thomas interjected smoothly. "As Melissa's mother and a beneficiary named in the will, her presence is required." Richard's jaw tightened, but he nodded and took a seat across the table from me. Stephanie sat beside him, her hand possessively on his arm. The tension in the room was palpable as two more people entered: Jenna, Melissa's closest friend, and David, Melissa's cousin, from my late husband's side of the family. "What are they doing here?" Richard demanded, his composure slipping. "Also named in the will," Thomas explained calmly, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Shall we begin?" I watched Richard's face carefully as Thomas opened the formal leather folder containing Melissa's last will and testament. His expression remained confident, even smug, as if he anticipated a favorable outcome. Stephanie whispered something in his ear, and he nodded slightly. Thomas cleared his throat and began reading from the document. "I, Melissa Ann Williams, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils." The formal legal language continued for several minutes before reaching the personal message Melissa had included. Thomas's voice softened slightly as he read her words. "Before addressing the distribution of my assets, I wish to speak directly to those I love. To my mother, Sharon. You have been my strength, my comfort, and my inspiration throughout my life. Your selfless love sustained me through the darkest days of my illness. Thank you for everything, Mom. I hope you know how deeply you are loved." Tears filled my eyes at these words, but I blinked them back, determined to remain composed. Thomas continued, "To my friends Jenna and David. Your friendship brought joy and laughter to my life. Your visits during my illness were bright spots in difficult days. Thank you for never treating me differently or with pity." Then Thomas paused, his expression turning serious as he read the next section. "To my husband, Richard. Our marriage was not what I believed it to be. While I lay fighting for my life, I discovered your betrayal with Stephanie. The hotel receipts, the text messages, the unexplained absences, all confirmed what I initially refused to believe. I forgive you not for your sake, but for my own peace. However, forgiveness does not mean enabling continued deception." Richard's face had drained of all color. Beside him, Stephanie shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward the door as if contemplating escape. "Therefore," Thomas continued reading, "I hereby declare that any and all joint assets, accounts or property shall revert to my mother, Sharon Williams, with the exception of personal items specifically designated below." "This is ridiculous," Richard interrupted, his voice tight with anger. "She wasn't in her right mind when she wrote this. The medications affected her judgment. I'll contest this entire will." Thomas simply raised an eyebrow and continued reading, detailing specific bequests: Melissa's jewelry collection to Jenna, her father's pocket watch, to David, her personal savings account, to be divided between 3 charities supporting cancer research. As Thomas neared the end of the document, he paused and looked directly at Richard. "There is one final matter regarding real property that must be addressed." He produced another document from his folder and placed it on the table. "This certified deed shows that the house at 1542 Maple Avenue is solely owned by Sharon Williams and has been for the past 3 years. Melissa transferred her interest in the property to her mother with full legal documentation." I reached into my handbag and withdrew my own copy of the transfer documents, sliding them across the table toward Richard. "I have the originals here as well," I said quietly. "The house has always been mine, Richard. First with Melissa as co-owner, then solely in my name." Richard stared at the documents, his face contorting with disbelief and rage. "This can't be legal. Melissa never told me about this." "It's perfectly legal," Thomas assured him. "Mrs. Williams and her daughter completed all necessary paperwork. Your wife was under no obligation to inform you, as the property was hers to transfer as she wished." "You conniving old witch," Richard hissed at me, his composed facade completely shattered. "You planned this all along." "No, Richard," I replied calmly. "I simply protected what was mine, and Melissa protected me, knowing what kind of man you truly are." Thomas interrupted the brewing confrontation by placing another document on the table. "This is an official notice to vacate the premises at 1542 Maple Avenue. You have 30 days from today's date to remove yourself and your belongings from the property." Richard snatched up the paper, his hands shaking with fury. "You can't do this. I'll fight it. I'll sue both of you." Thomas's expression remained professionally neutral. "You're welcome to pursue legal action, Mr. Williams, though I wouldn't advise it, especially given what else we discovered during our investigation." "What investigation?" Richard demanded. "The one Melissa requested concerning certain financial irregularities during her illness," Thomas explained. "Specifically, the second mortgage you took out on the house without her knowledge, using forged signatures, and the life insurance policy you borrowed against, and the unusual transfers from your joint accounts to an offshore entity." Richard's face went from red to ashen in seconds. Beside him, Stephanie was already gathering her purse, clearly wanting no part in whatever was coming next. "You have no proof," Richard stammered, but his eyes betrayed his panic. "We have enough to warrant a full investigation," Thomas countered. "Whether or not that proceeds is entirely up to Mrs. Williams here." All eyes turned to me. In that moment, I thought of Melissa, of her suffering, of her courage in the face of both cancer and betrayal. I thought of Richard's cruelty in evicting me hours after we buried my daughter. I thought of the woman beside him who had helped him deceive Melissa during her final months. "I haven't decided yet," I said finally. "But I suggest you comply with the eviction notice without contest, Richard. That might influence my decision regarding further legal action." Richard stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This isn't over," he threatened, though his voice lacked conviction. "Stephanie, we're leaving." The blonde woman was already halfway to the door, clearly wanting to distance herself from the unfolding disaster. Richard followed her, pausing at the threshold to look back at me with pure hatred in his eyes. 30 days, Richard," I reminded him calmly. "Not a day more." After the door slammed behind him, the room remained silent for several moments. Then Jenna reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Melissa would be so proud of you," she said softly. "She planned all this so carefully, wanting to protect you." She knew exactly who he was by the end, I agreed, feeling a strange mixture of vindication and deep sorrow. I just wish she hadn't had to learn it while fighting for her life. As we concluded the formal proceedings, Thomas reassured me that legally I was on solid ground. Richard might bluster and threaten, but he had no case. The house was mine. The insurance money was mine. And if he pushed too hard, he might find himself facing serious fraud charges. As Janet and I left the office, I felt a strange lightness despite my grief. Not happiness exactly, but perhaps the first stirrings of what might eventually become peace. Melissa had protected me from beyond ensuring I wouldn't face homelessness or destitution in my grief. Now it was my turn to honor her memory by rebuilding my life. "What now?" Janet asked as we walked to the car. I took a deep breath of spring air, feeling the warm sun on my face. "Now we wait 30 days, and then I go home." The 30 days Richard had to vacate my house passed with surprising swiftness. Despite his threats at the will reading, he made no legal attempts to contest the eviction. Thomas suspected the mention of financial improprieties had successfully deterred him from drawing further attention to his activities. Janet accompanied me on the day I reclaimed my home. We arrived with cleaning supplies, new linens, and a small houseplant symbols of the fresh start I was determined to make. I held my breath as I inserted the key into the lock, half expecting to find destruction inside. Richard's final act of spite. Instead, the house was eerily clean and emptier than I expected. Richard had taken all the furniture from the main living areas, leaving only items that had clearly belonged to Melissa or me. Her piano remained in the corner of the living room. The antique secretary desk that had been my mother's stood untouched in the hallway. My books still lined the shelves in the guest room that had been mine. "At least he didn't trash the place," Janet observed, running a finger along a dusty windowsill. "Though it doesn't look like he cleaned before leaving either." "Small mercies," I replied, moving slowly through the rooms, reacquainting myself with the space that had witnessed so much joy and sorrow. The master bedroom was completely stripped, the mattress gone, the closets empty of all but a few of Melissa's clothes that Richard apparently hadn't wanted. I stood in the doorway, remembering how this room had transformed during Melissa's illness, becoming a hospital-like space with medical equipment and medication schedules posted on the wall. "I don't think I can sleep in here," I told Janet quietly. "Not yet, anyway." "You don't have to," she reassured me. "We'll set up your old room first. Take this one step at a time." Over the next few days, friends and family rallied around me. Jenna organized a furniture drive, collecting donated pieces to replace what Richard had taken. David and his husband helped repaint the living room and kitchen, covering the walls with warm, cheerful colors that Melissa would have loved. My church group provided meals and companionship as I settled back in. The most difficult task was sorting through Melissa's remaining possessions. Each item carried memories, some joyful, others painfully bittersweet. I created a system setting aside things to keep donate or pass on to specific friends who might treasure them. In her office, I found a locked filing cabinet that Richard had apparently been unable to open. The key was hidden exactly where Melissa and I had always hidden spare keys, taped inside the ceramic frog planter on the windowsill. A mother-daughter secret from years before. Inside the cabinet, I discovered Melissa's journals, dating back to her college years and continuing through her illness. For days, I couldn't bring myself to read them, feeling it would be an invasion of her privacy. But one evening, about a week after moving back in, I finally opened the most recent journal. Inside the cover was a note in Melissa's handwriting. "Mom, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've found my journals. They are for you now. Maybe they'll help you understand the things I couldn't say out loud. I love you, always, Melissa." Through tears, I began reading. The early entries documented her growing suspicions about Richard's infidelity, her discovery of text messages, receipts, unexplained absences. Later entries revealed the emotional abuse that had been happening behind closed doors for years. "Richard says I'm overreacting about the pain," she wrote 3 months into her treatment. He told me I'm being dramatic when I can't get out of bed. Said his mother never complained this much when she had surgery years ago. I reminded him that cancer isn't the same as a hip replacement. He walked out and didn't come home until midnight. Another entry dated just weeks before her death. Mom continues to be my guardian angel. Richard can barely look at me now that I've lost my hair and so much weight. He flinches when he sees my surgery scars. But Mom bathes me, helps me change my clothes, applies lotion to my dry skin, all without a single look of disgust or pity. Just love. I wish I'd listened to her subtle warnings about Richard years ago. Reading these private thoughts was both heartbreaking and healing. I learned the depth of Richard's betrayal, but also the depth of Melissa's love and resilience. She had faced both terminal illness and the collapse of her marriage with extraordinary grace. As weeks turned into months, I slowly transformed the house into a space that honored Melissa's memory while allowing me room to heal. I converted her office into a memorial room of sorts, displaying her teaching awards, framed photos of her with her students, and the beautiful quilt her students' parents had made for her when she first became ill, each square containing a message of love and encouragement. Neighbors who had witnessed Richard's disrespectful behavior after Melissa's death stopped by with casseroles, flowers, and offers of help with yard work or household repairs. Many shared stories about Melissa. I hadn't known small kindnesses she had extended to others that had gone unmentioned. She tutored my son twice a week for an entire semester, my neighbor Ellen told me over tea one afternoon. Never accepted a penny for it, said she just wanted to see him succeed. Another neighbor, Mr. Grayson, a widower in his 80s, revealed that Melissa had shopped for his groceries every Sunday after church. She'd bring them by on her way home, arrange everything in my kitchen, just how Martha used to do it. Never mentioned it to anyone, just did it because she knew I couldn't drive anymore. These stories became treasures. New memories of my daughter that helped balance the painful ones from her final months. 6 months after reclaiming my home, I received a card from Thomas. Inside was a newspaper clipping announcing Richard's firm had let him go following irregularities discovered during a routine audit. A handwritten note from Thomas simply said, "Justice comes in many forms. Melissa would be pleased." I learned through mutual acquaintances that Richard had moved to another state, his relationship with Stephanie having ended shortly after the will reading. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a sense that balance had been restored to the universe in some small way. The first holiday season without Melissa was predictably difficult. Janet insisted I join her family for Thanksgiving, filling the day with noise and activity to keep grief at bay. For Christmas, I chose a different approach, volunteering at the hospital, where I had once worked as a nurse, offering comfort to patients spending the holiday away from home. Through a grief support group at my church, I met other parents who had lost adult children. Their understanding brought comfort that even the most well-meaning friends couldn't provide. One member, Patricia, had started a scholarship fund in her son's name after losing him to leukemia. Inspired by her example, I worked with Melissa's school to establish a small scholarship for future teachers funded by the modest insurance policy she had left me. This act of creation from loss became profoundly healing. Each year we would help a deserving student pursue the career Melissa had loved so much. Her influence would continue to ripple outward, touching lives she would never know. As the 1-year anniversary of Melissa's death approached, I felt a shift in my grief. The raw, jagged edges had softened somewhat. I could speak her name without my voice breaking. I could look at her photos and smile at the memories rather than weep at the loss. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something I could carry more easily. On the anniversary itself, I visited her grave alone. The permanent headstone had been placed months earlier, a simple, elegant marker, with her name dates and the inscription, "Beloved daughter and teacher, her light continues." I brought yellow roses and a small stone from the garden she had loved tending. As I sat beside her grave, I realized how much she had taught me even in her death, about courage and dignity in the face of suffering, about preparing for the worst while hoping for the best, about protecting those you love through both practical and emotional means. "You saved me twice," I told her, placing my hand on the cool stone. "First by giving me a reason to go on after your father died, and then by making sure I would be safe after you left. I promise I'm living the life you wanted for me, a life with purpose and connection." I stayed until sunset, reminiscing aloud about favorite memories, sharing updates about her former students, and finally falling into comfortable silence as the sky turned golden and pink. As I prepared to leave, I kissed my fingers and pressed them to her name. "I carry you with me," I whispered, "always." The path ahead would never be what I had envisioned when Melissa was alive. There would be no grandchildren to bounce on my knee, no family holidays with her at the center, no sharing the joys and challenges of watching her grow older. But there would be purpose. There would be love. There would be her ongoing influence in the world through the lives she had touched and the protections she had put in place for me. And somehow I knew there would eventually be joy again too. Different, tempered by loss, but joy nonetheless. Melissa would have wanted that above all. If you've experienced loss or betrayal in your own life, I hope my story offers some comfort. We are stronger than we know, especially when supported by those who truly love us. Have you ever discovered unexpected strength during difficult times? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. Please like and subscribe to hear more stories of resilience and share this with someone who might need encouragement today. Thank you for listening to my journey, and may you find peace in your own.